All right, peace. We have part three now. Uh, each of these gentlemen are giving their own personal take on the Confederate flag. Stephen A. Smith, he's the black liberal. He wants everybody to feel sorry for him. Max Kellerman, he's the white liberal. He has to go extra hard on screen, but off camera, I'm sure it's something different. And then Will Kane, he's the and I normally don't go hard at so-called conservatives because they normally don't give me a reason to, because they're normally very straightforward. When it comes to matters of the American flag or Confederate flag, that's normally when the conservatives' hypocrisy comes out. A lot of people in the comments section mistake my statements about liberals as meaning that I am so-called with the conservatives. I'm with neither. All right. It's just that that so-called black people tend to follow liberals. So the liberal agenda has to be addressed far more than the so-called conservative agenda. But so-called black people, they have such a binary method of thinking, like they either think that everything is either left or right, that they have a hard time grasping certain concepts. But anyway, let's get on to part three and let's see what these guys are talking about with the Confederate flag.
Let's acknowledge the fact that to African Americans, it means one very specific thing, something that I can acknowledge, something that I alter my behavior. I would not do this because I acknowledge that it means that very specific things to African Americans. And your question is, why is that not enough? The answer, I think, has to be this, that over the last half century, the Confederate flag has not only meant that. You and Max have both admitted that to me just now. The swastika, the Nazi flag, has very little meaning to anyone beyond that abhorrent time in history. Okay.
That's a complete and total lie. The swastika is a symbol of sun worship. All right? That's where the Nazis got it from. The so-called Nazis were occultists. All right? They were believers and worshipers in the sun god. The sun god demands blood sacrifice. When people have a hard time understanding why the so-called Nazis were so sadistic, it was because they worship the sun god. The sun god demands a sacrifice. If you know anything about the meaning of the swastika is a symbol of sun worship, whether it be the so-called Aztecs or the people of ancient India. They were believers in sun worship. It always demands a sacrifice, whether you call that sun god, whether you call him Baal or Molech or Zeus or whatever you want to call him, Osiris. He demands a sacrifice. It is blood sacrifice. So that is why the Nazis adopted it. All right. They were deep into the occult. All right. That's the meaning behind the swastika. They took that, and numerous cultures around the world still utilize the swastika symbol. It's normally a symbol of like a Vedic, what they call Vedic belief system, which is based out in ancient India. So again, this guy, he didn't know what he's talking about.
Okay. But I think we have all acknowledged that this Confederate flag has a meaning beyond a similarly horrendous moment in history.
What is the meaning?
It's regional pride. It's regional identity. And
Even Molly looks confused at his attempt to try to spin doctor it. All right. Why would you even try to spin that unless you are a believer in that? And I always say this. Whatever you co-sign, you can't get upset if people associate you with that belief. If somebody were to come and try to justify pedophilia, you would assume that they were a pedophile. If somebody were to justify robbery, you would assume that they were a thief. For him to try to justify the use of the Confederate flag, he must be a sympathizer. At the end of the day, you can't claim to be a proud American when it suits you and then claim to be a proud Southerner when it suits you. You're either one or the other. At the end of the day, the Confederate flag is a symbol of sedition and secession. It's a symbol of wanting to leave the so-called Union, the same United States that many of these so-called Southern white conservatives claim to be so proud of, and claim that that people like Colin Kaepernick should not be protesting the flag. Well, when you fly a Confederate flag, you are indirectly coming against the American flag. Period. There's no way against that. There's no methodology that you can use to try to substantiate any validity in trying to fly the so-called Confederate flag. You are a so-called American. You're a so-called proud American. So you should be ready to fly the so-called American flag. When Colin Kaepernick sits out against the so-called national anthem, they call him a so-called terrorist. Well, then how come these white Christians or white conservatives who are normally so-called Christians in the South, when they fly their Confederate flag, they're not classified as terrorists? Colin Kaepernick has never waged a war against the U.S. government like the South has. So every so-called Confederate flag should be burned by the edicts of America, not by my standards. I could care less what the so-called white man flies. That's his business. But just in and of itself, the Confederate flag is a symbol of sedition. Period.
I could play psychotherapist and try to suggest why. I think the South, I think this is not stretching. The South has some level of insecurity towards the way the North has viewed it. It's viewed as dumb. It's viewed as backwards. That makes people view themselves
the Confederate
more
flag
insular.
really helps. Hold on, Max.
They attach themselves to things like geographic pride and symbols, and not always wrongly. And then finally, when they have this symbol that they feel like honors who they are, and they're told, no, that's...
How could that symbol honor who you are if you claim to be a so-called proud American? There are many regions in America, not just the South. You have the Northeast, you have the Midwest, you have the West, you have the Northwest. They don't feel the need to fly their own flag representing that region. All right. All this is just another method or another attempt by somebody from the South to try to justify the flying of a symbol that has nothing to do with regional pride, but everything to do with secession and sedition. I've said over and over and over again because that's all it is. So the only real question is, how come the U.S. government has not outlawed the use of or the flying of the Confederate flag?
Evil, there will be a fight
No, I want to address that. I want to address that specifically. No, it's the insistence that evil is not enough to ignore anything else. In other words, that the idea of the institution of slavery and the vicious and bloody fight they put up for it does not then forfeit any pride they may have in anything else. In other words,
to be clear, I have to set this record straight. I feel like we're having almost two different conversations here at times.
We are.
You guys are having a debate with me, but you did this too. Listen, about whether or not slavery was a mark on our history. No one debates the nature of slavery and the evil that it represents.
I'm not saying that.
But the point is, the debate
it's not the defining
is
issue
over the symbol. The
right.
debate
So
is over
then it
the
becomes
flag and whether that's all that the flag means.
That is what we're debating, because that becomes the defining issue. And if that didn't become the defining issue for somebody, then I have to question their intelligence or their
No, this guy does the same thing every time. Every time he can't understand somebody else's viewpoint, he has to question their intelligence. This is normal white liberal tactics. You don't agree with me, so you must be dumb. No, a person's intelligence or stupidity is based on their reasoning and their ability to justify their reasoning. That's it. It's not dependent or predicated on whether or not they agree with your viewpoint. But that's normal fascist liberal thought process. You don't agree with me, so you must be an idiot. You're an idiot, so you deserve to not be heard. All right?
Their character. That's fine, and you're not wrong. You don't even have to go there. You're not wrong. But let me get back to you. Because again, you're talking about what the Confederate flag means to those folks. Again, we can debate that because some folks, like you said, they're not thinking about African Americans. They're not thinking about what the Civil War represented. They're not thinking about the history of the Confederate flag from somebody else's vantage point, just their own. And I totally concede that. I totally concede that there are some people, and Max is saying that they're misinformed or whatever he wants to say, and I get all of that. What I'm saying to you is this. Then how come the same doesn't apply to the Jewish community?
Because they control the banks, bruh. I don't understand what this... See, just to use that term Jewish community, you have to understand that term Jewish implies a culture. Because they have a series of laws that correspond to that title of Jewish. All right? When you think of the term Jewish, you might think of a guy with curls on the side of his head with a yarmulke on. But they have the so-called Talmud. They have the Torah. They have their own homeland. They have their own belief system. They have a language. There's a lot that goes along with that. as well as control of the banks. So, and they have their own military. That's how you get respect. You don't get respect by trying to appeal to the heart of your oppressor. If your oppressor had a heart, he would not have oppressed you in the first place. All right. This is where once again the thinking process of the black liberal is completely flawed. All right. And this gentleman, Stephen A. Smith, he wants to expand from sports talk to real talk. And you to engage in real talk, you have to have a very extensive knowledge base. You just can't be a great shit talker. You see, a lot of black dudes, they mistake being a good shit talker for actually knowing what you're talking about. But anyway.
Because let me tell you something. You go down south, you see folks everywhere, highly sensitive. I would say to you that because the African American community has historically been disenfranchised and disempowered, as a result, because you don't have to worry about the fallout, the ramifications that emanate from ignoring black history, you can then exercise that kind of thinking for those that are supportive of using the Confederate flag, because they would never do that to the Jewish community.
Because the Jewish community won't let them. They won't let them. At one point in time in America's history, you could go to a beach and the beach would say no blacks or Jews allowed. Right? Muhammad Ali once told this story. He said down in Miami, there was a beach that said no blacks or Jews allowed. He said, you know what the Jews did? They bought the beach. Once again, like I said before, there is no power in politics. So-called blacks have been programmed to believe that there's power in politics. Power in politics only comes when you have a strong culture, because when you have a culture, then you have a strong economy amongst your people. Once you have a strong economy, then you can buy the politicians. Then you buy the politicians. All right, you grease their pocket, you keep them well funded. And they pass the acts and the laws that you want them to pass. They draft the bills that you want them to draft. That's what politics is about. It's about having somebody in your pocket. It's not about listening to a nice speech that sounds good and saying, I'm going to vote for him. That's not what politics is about. That's what politics is about for people who are slave-minded. And this is what this guy's just not getting. He's trying to compare so-called black people to so-called Jewish people, not understanding that the so-called Jewish people, they run the banks. They control the money. And that's all it's about.
We're going to take a break, and we're going to come back and wrap this up in just a moment and get into some other subjects. Stay here. It's First Take.
All right, cool. Well, you know what? We're gonna take a break. We're gonna take it to part 4 also, and try to finish this out. But this is a very important conversation, because it's very, very important that the so-called black man in particular, and people in general, who's ever listening, no matter what so-called race or so-called belief system you have, to understand certain things about this media. They just put out so much false information. These people get on TV and they have the green light to speak on issues that they know nothing about, to speak on topics that they know nothing about, and to perpetuate false narratives. Very, 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 very bad disservice that they do to the people. All right, peace.